Impossible Foods claims to be a sustainable burger company. In reality, it is a genetic engineering firm. Its multi-billion-dollar valuation rests on a single patented molecule harvested from modified yeast, Heme, a substance designed to mimic the taste of blood. Founded in 2011 by Stanford biochemist Patrick O. Brown, the goal was not to feed vegans, but to render the global beef industry obsolete through science. While the Impossible Whopper made the brand famous, its methods remain deeply controversial. Brown defied the natural food movement by embracing GMOs, sparking a global debate on whether saving the planet requires changing the fundamental definition of food. When science created blood from yeast. In 2009, Patrick Brown was arguably one of the most important geneticists on the planet. He didn't care about culinary trends, he cared about data. As a Stanford professor and the inventor of the DNA microarray, Brown had spent decades mapping the human genome and revolutionizing cancer research. He wasn't a chef, and he certainly wasn't a hippie trying to sell tofu. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a man operating at the absolute pinnacle of molecular biology. But in 2009, Patrick Brown took a sabbatical. He wanted to figure out the single biggest problem facing the human species. He looked at the data on climate change, water scarcity, and biodiversity loss. He ran the numbers, expecting to find the culprit in coal plants or gas-guzzling SUVs. Instead, he found the cow. The data was undeniable. Animal agriculture was occupying nearly half of the world's ice-free land. It was consuming a quarter of the world's fresh water. It was a primary driver of the extinction crisis. To Brown, the cow was not an animal. It was a technology. It was a machine designed to convert plant matter like grass and corn into protein. But as a scientist, Brown looked at this machine and saw gross inefficiency. The cow was a terrible technology. Its conversion rate was abysmal. To get 1 calorie of beef, you had to input nearly 25 calories of plant crops. It was an outdated, polluting, inefficient bioreactor that hadn't been upgraded in 10,000 years. Brown realized that the environmental movement had been approaching the problem the wrong way for 50 years. Activists had been begging people to stop eating meat. They used guilt. They used images of slaughterhouses. They appealed to ethics. But Brown knew that human biology is stronger than human ethics. People love meat. They love the taste, the texture, and the way it makes them feel. You cannot guilt a species out of its evolutionary craving. He formed a hypothesis. The problem isn't that people like meat. The problem is that meat is currently made by animals. If you could build a machine that turned plants into meat more efficiently than a cow, and if that meat tasted exactly the same or better, the cow would become obsolete, not because of morality, but because of economics and technology. In 2011, Brown left his prestigious tenure at Stanford. He didn't retire, he incorporated. He founded Impossible Foods in Redwood City, California. The name was a challenge. Colleagues told him it was impossible to mimic the complexity of animal muscle fibers using vegetable proteins. He started with a seed round of roughly $9 million, primarily from Khosla Ventures. Vinod Khosla, a legendary Silicon Valley investor, didn't invest because he liked veggie burgers. He invested because Brown pitched him a technology company. Brown wasn't pitching a better garden burger. He was pitching a molecular disassembly of the global food system. The early days of Impossible Foods looked nothing like a food startup. There were no test kitchens smelling of spices. It was a biochemistry lab. The facility was filled with mass spectrometers, gas chromatographs, and texture analyzers, machines usually used to test steel or pharmaceuticals. Brown hired a team of 50 scientists, physicists, biochemists, and molecular biologists. Their mandate was strange and specific: do not cook, analyze. They spent the first 2 years, from 2011 to 2013, doing a forensic autopsy on meat. They took beef apart, molecule by molecule. They heated it up, captured the vapors, and ran them through spectrometers to identify the thousands of volatile organic compounds that create the aroma of a steak. They measured the tensile strength of connective tissue. They analyzed the melting point of bovine fat. They were looking for the ghost in the machine. They wanted to know why a mixture of soy and wheat tastes like bread, but a mixture of muscle and fat tastes like murder. What was the specific chemical signature of meat? They tested thousands of plant proteins. They ground up zucchini, cabbage, soy, and peas. They tried to emulsify plant fats to mimic the marbling of a ribeye. The early results were disastrous. The prototypes tasted like polenta or like rancid nuts. They had the nutrition of meat, but they lacked the soul. They were burning through cash, roughly $3 million a year just on lab equipment and salaries, with zero revenue. To an outsider, it looked like a vanity project. But Patrick Brown was convinced that the secret lay hidden somewhere in the molecular structure of life itself. He knew that plants and animals shared a common ancestor if you went back far enough in the evolutionary tree. There had to be a shared molecule, a common thread that connected the blood of a cow to the roots of a plant. And then, in late 2012, amidst a pile of data from a root nodule analysis, they found it. The magic bullet, the molecule that would change food history and eventually land them in the center of a global firestorm. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived in late 2012, was microscopic. Patrick Brown's team had spent months isolating proteins, stripping them down, and tasting them. But everything tasted like vegetables. The missing link was the metallic, bloody richness that defines a hamburger. Brown returned to his background in biochemistry and focused on a molecule known as heme. Heme is an iron-containing molecule found in every living plant and animal. It is the magic transporter. In animals, it is found in hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen through the veins. It is what makes blood red. It is what gives raw meat its pink hue. And crucially, Brown hypothesized, it is the catalyst for flavor. When meat is cooked, the heme molecule acts as a high-speed chemical reactor. It catalyzes the transformation of simple nutrients into the explosion of odors and flavors we recognize as meaty. Without heme, a burger is just a puck of cooked protein. With heme, it is a steak. The team found that plants also have heme. Specifically, leguminous plants like soybeans have a protein called leghemoglobin in their root nodules. It functions almost identically to animal hemoglobin. Evolutionarily speaking, soy roots were bleeding the same blood as a cow, just in microscopic quantities. To prove the theory, the scientists performed a manual extraction. They spent weeks digging up soybean roots, washing off the dirt, and crushing the nodules to extract tiny drops of red fluid. They mixed this plant blood with a simple binder of wheat protein and fat. They cooked it, the lab filled with the smell of searing meat. When they tasted it, the difference was undeniable. It wasn't perfect, but the metallic, bloody, savory note was there. They had hacked the flavor code. They had found the ghost. But discovery is not production. And this is where Impossible Foods ran headfirst into the brutal reality of agriculture. To produce enough leghemoglobin to supply even a single restaurant, they calculated they would need to dig up millions of soybean plants. Leghemoglobin only exists in the roots, underground. You cannot harvest it with a combine harvester. You have to destroy the plant to get it. This created a paradox. Patrick Brown had started the company to save the soil and reduce land use. But digging up soy roots causes massive soil erosion and releases carbon stored in the ground. If they tried to scale this method, they would become an environmental villain, not a savior. The cost would be astronomical. Thousands of dollars per pound of blood. The natural path was a dead end. It was 2013. The seed money was burning fast. The company faced an existential choice. They could abandon the Heme idea and make a mediocre veggie burger like everyone else using beet juice for color, which unfortunately turns brown and tastes like dirt when cooked. Or they could double down on science. Patrick Brown looked at the problem and saw a solution that was elegant in the lab but radioactive in the public square. If they couldn't harvest the heme from the soil without destroying the planet, they would have to print it. They decided to use genetic modification. The plan was straight out of a cyberpunk novel. They would take the specific DNA sequence from the soy plant, the code that instructs the root to create leghemoglobin, and synthesize it. They would then insert that DNA sequence into a species of yeast called Pichia pastoris. This yeast is a workhorse of modern biotechnology, commonly used to produce insulin for diabetics. By editing the DNA of the yeast, they could turn the microbial cells into miniature biological factories. They would feed the yeast sugar and minerals in massive steel tanks, and the yeast would ferment. But instead of producing alcohol like a brewery, these genetically modified cells would pump out pure, red, liquid leghemoglobin. It was fermentation, it was brewing, but they were brewing blood. This decision, made in the quiet confines of the Redwood City lab, was the crossing of the Rubicon. By choosing to use GMO yeast, Brown was effectively guaranteeing that his product would be rejected by the all-natural and organic movements. He was guaranteeing a war with the non-GMO project. He was alienating the very demographic, vegans and health purists, that historically supported plant-based meat. But Brown didn't care about the vegans. He cared about the meat eaters. And he bet the entire company on a single cynical insight. Meat eaters don't care about natural. They care about delicious. If the burger tasted like a cow, nobody would care if it came from a test tube. With the science theoretically solved, the financial reality set in. R&D is expensive. By 2014, the initial $9 million was evaporating. The company had spent years analyzing molecules and had zero revenue to show for it. They were in the valley of death. To survive, they needed a believer with deeper pockets than God. In 2014 and 2015, Impossible Foods raised a staggering Series B and C rounds, totaling over $180 million. The investors included Li Ka-shing's Horizon Ventures and, most notably, Bill Gates. Gates didn't just write a check, he visited the lab. He tasted the prototype. At this stage, the burger was still a rough approximation, a mix of textured wheat protein, coconut oil for fat, and the genetically engineered Heme. It cost nearly $20 per patty to produce. But when Gates took a bite, he didn't taste the wheat. He tasted the potential. He famously noted that the experience was mind-boggling. With the war chest replenished, the team moved from pure research to pre-production. They built a pilot facility in Redwood City. It looked less like a kitchen and more like an oil refinery filled with gleaming steel bioreactors, humming with the activity of billions of yeast cells. By late 2015, they had done it. They had a burger that sizzled. They had a burger that smelled like roasted beef. And most importantly, they had a burger that bled. The Impossible Burger was born. But having a product and having a business are two different things. Patrick Brown was a scientist, not a salesman. He knew how to talk to yeast, but He didn't know how to talk to the American public. The world viewed lab-grown food with suspicion and fear. To sell this Frankenburger, they couldn't just put it in the freezer aisle next to the Boca Burgers. They needed a stage. They needed a cultural moment. They needed to launch not as a grocery item, but as a culinary revelation, selling a luxury dream to the working class. By early 2016, Impossible Foods had a product that worked. The Impossible Burger 1.0 was a marvel of biochemical engineering. It sizzled, it smelled like iron and fat, and thanks to the genetically modified Heme, it bled just like a medium-rare beef patty. But Patrick Brown faced a critical commercial dilemma. Where do you sell a $20 fake meat patty? The conventional wisdom for a food startup was simple. You go to Whole Foods. You fight for shelf space in the frozen section. You sit in a cardboard box next to the Boca Burgers, the Garden Burgers, and the black bean patties. You accept your fate as a niche product for vegetarians. But Brown and his new chief operating officer, David Lee, recruited from the gaming giant Zynga, knew that the grocery store was a trap. If they launched in the supermarket, consumers would instantly categorize them as just another veggie burger. They would be judged by the low standards of the category. They would be seen as an alternative for people who couldn't eat meat, not a desire for people who did. So they threw out the food industry playbook and borrowed one from Silicon Valley. They adopted the Tesla strategy. Elon Musk didn't launch Tesla with an affordable sedan like the Model 3. He launched with the Roadster, a high-performance, expensive, exclusive sports car. He proved that electric cars could be sexy and desirable before he tried to make them accessible. He made the rich and famous want one first. Impossible Foods decided to do the exact same thing. They would not sell the burger as a grocery item. They would sell it as a luxury experience. They would launch it in a single high-end restaurant, prepared by a celebrity chef with a price tag that screamed premium. They needed a culinary gatekeeper. They needed a chef who was famous for loving meat, someone whose endorsement would silence the skeptics. They found their man in New York City, David Chang. David Chang was the chef founder of Momofuku. He was the bad boy of the culinary world, known for his obsession with pork belly, fried chicken, and unpretentious meaty deliciousness. He was not a vegan. He had famously removed vegetarian options from his menus in the past. If David Chang put a veggie burger on his menu, the world would listen. Patrick Brown flew to New York with a cooler full of the prototype patties. He walked into the kitchen of Momofuku Nishi. The meeting was tense. Chang was skeptical. He had tasted 1,000 veggie burgers, and he hated them all. Brown fired up the flat-top grill. He threw the patty on. The room filled with the smell of searing meat. Chang watched the fat render. He watched the crust form. When he took the first bite, his eyes widened. In a later interview, Chang recalled that moment. I tasted it, and I was like, oh shit, this is gonna change the world. He realized that he wasn't eating vegetables. He was eating science that had successfully hacked his taste buds. On July 27th, 2016, the revolution officially began. Impossible Foods launched at Momofuku Nishi in Chelsea, New York. The Nishi-style Impossible Burger was priced at $12. Expensive for a burger, but cheap for a piece of the future. It was served simply with lettuce, tomato, pickles, and special sauce on a potato roll. The reaction was immediate and hysterical. People lined up around the block in the sweltering New York summer heat. They weren't vegans. They were foodies, tech enthusiasts, and curious carnivores. The media frenzy was unprecedented. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Vogue all sent reporters to taste the bleeding plant burger. The reviews were the stuff of PR dreams. One critic wrote, "It tastes like beef. Not like beef-flavored soy, but like actual cow-based beef." Another noted the way the blood soaked into the bottom bun, creating that quintessential greasy burger experience that no black bean patty could ever replicate. By launching at a high-end restaurant, Impossible Foods had achieved the impossible. They had made a veggie burger cool. It became a status symbol. Posting a picture of the Impossible Burger on Instagram was a flex. It signaled that you were in the know, that you were eating the future. This strategy of artificial scarcity worked perfectly. For the rest of 2016, you could effectively only get the burger at Momofuku Nishi and a handful of other elite restaurants in California, like Jardiniere in San Francisco. The limited supply drove the hype cycle to a fever pitch. Chefs from across the country began calling Patrick Brown, begging for an allocation of the magic meat. But the hype hit a terrifying operational reality. The factory making these burgers was still a glorified pilot plant. The fermentation tanks were small. The manual labor was intense. They were hand-packing patties to meet the demand of just 4 restaurants. To go from feeding David Chang's customers to feeding America, Impossible Foods needed to scale up production by a factor of 10,000. They needed to leave the lab and enter the industrial age. And as they broke ground on their first massive factory in Oakland, they were about to discover that biology does not always scale as easily as software. By the dawn of 2017, the Tesla strategy had succeeded beyond Patrick Brown's wildest dreams. The Impossible Burger was the most talked about food item in America. It was a media darling. But inside the company, the mood was not celebratory. It was panic. The strategy of artificial scarcity had created real demand, but now that demand was threatening to crush them. They had promised the world a revolution, but they were still making the ammunition by hand. The small pilot facility in Redwood City was running 24 hours a day, pushing its bioreactors to the breaking point, yet they could barely supply the handful of high-end restaurants on their roster. To fulfill the vision of replacing the cow, Impossible Foods needed a factory, not a kitchen, but a massive industrial-grade manufacturing plant. They found their site in Oakland, California. It was a cavernous 68,000 square foot warehouse that used to be a bakery. They gutted it and began to install the infrastructure of the future. The heart of the Oakland facility was the fermentation room. This was where the magic happened. Dozens of 2-story tall steel tanks were installed to house the genetically modified yeast. The process was theoretically simple. Feed the yeast sugar, control the temperature, and wait for them to excrete the red blood-like leghemoglobin. But biology is notoriously difficult to scale. In a small 10-liter lab tank, you can control every variable perfectly. In a 40,000-liter industrial silo, things go wrong. Temperature gradients shift, oxygen levels fluctuate, contamination is a constant threat. Throughout 2017, the engineering team faced what Elon Musk would later call production hell. The yeast was temperamental. Batches of Heme, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, would sometimes fail, producing low yields or off flavors. The blood wasn't flowing fast enough. Simultaneously, the downstream processing, the mixing of the heme with wheat protein, coconut oil, and potato protein was causing headaches. The texture of the meat depends on how these ingredients bind together. If the mixer ran too hot, the fat melted too early. If it ran too cold, the binding failed, and the burgers crumbled on the grill. The consequences of these delays were immediate. In mid-2017, Impossible Foods faced its first major supply crisis. They had signed contracts with regional burger chains like Bear Burger and Umami Burger, promising them steady shipments. But the trucks weren't showing up. Restaurant owners were furious. They had printed menus featuring the famous Impossible Burger, and now they had to tell customers they were sold out. It was a PR nightmare. The scarcity, which was once a cool marketing tactic, was now a sign of incompetence. Patrick Brown and David Lee had to make tough calls. They paused expansion. They told new potential partners, thousands of restaurants clamoring for the product, to wait. They focused every ounce of energy on stabilizing the Oakland line. It was a race against time. They were burning cash on the factory construction, and they were losing revenue every day the machines sat idle. The critics began to whisper, was this just another Silicon Valley vaporware? Was the Impossible Burger actually impossible to mass produce? But by late 2017, the engineers cracked the code. They optimized the fermentation algorithms. The red liquid began to flow consistently. The Oakland factory roared to life, capable of producing 1 million pounds of plant-based meat per month. With the supply chain finally unlocked, Impossible Foods was ready to make its next move. They had conquered the elite foodies in New York. Now they wanted the real America. They wanted the late-night drive-thru. They wanted the stoners, the truckers, and the families on a budget. They were about to make a pivot that would seem insane to any luxury brand. They were going from David Chang's Michelin star kitchen to a square steam-grilled slider in a cardboard box. With the Oakland factory humming and the supply chain stabilized, Impossible Foods faced a cultural reckoning. By early 2018, they had successfully courted the coastal elites. The Impossible Burger was a hit in the Michelin-starred restaurants of Manhattan and the farm-to-table bistros of San Francisco. But Patrick Brown had not built a company to feed wealthy foodies. His mission was to replace the cow, and the cow does not live in Chelsea. The cow lives in the drive-thru. To make a dent in global climate change, Impossible Foods had to win over a demographic that viewed veganism with suspicion, if not outright hostility. They needed the truckers, the late-night partiers, and the working-class families of the Midwest. They needed to prove that their high-tech, genetically modified patty could survive in the most unforgiving culinary environment on Earth, the fast food kitchen. In a move that baffled industry analysts, Impossible Foods announced their next exclusive partnership. They weren't going to Shake Shack. They weren't going to In-N-Out. They were going to White Castle. White Castle is an American institution, but it is not a premium brand. Founded in 1921, it is the oldest fast food chain in the country, famous for its small, square, steam-grilled sliders that cost less than $1. It is the spiritual home of the Crave, a place immortalized in pop culture by the movie Harold and Kumar as a destination for the intoxicated and the hungry. The partnership was a study in contrasts. On one side, you had a billion-dollar Silicon Valley biotech firm led by a Stanford geneticist. On the other, a family-owned slider chain based in Columbus, Ohio, famous for greasy onions and cardboard boxes. But for David Lee, the COO, White Castle was the perfect testing ground. If the Impossible Burger could succeed here, stripped of the truffle mayo and the artisanal buns, it could succeed anywhere. It was the ultimate stress test for the Heme molecule. Could it stand up to the steam grill? Could it mimic the iconic taste of a White Castle slider, which is 50% meat and 50% onion? On April 12th, 2018, the Impossible Slider debuted at 140 White Castle locations in New York, New Jersey, and Chicago. The price was $1.99. The result was a cultural shockwave. For the first time, a plant-based burger wasn't a healthy alternative tucked away on a special menu. It was just a slider. It looked exactly like the beef version. It was square. It had the 5 holes punched in it. It was covered in the same rehydrated onions. The reception was phenomenal. White Castle reported that the Impossible Slider was one of the most successful product launches in their 100-year history. Sales at the pilot locations exceeded expectations by 30%. But the most interesting data point wasn't the volume, it was the customer. These weren't vegans. The people buying the Impossible slider were the same people buying the chicken rings and the mozzarella sticks. They were curious meat eaters. They were buying one beef slider and one Impossible slider to compare them. They were buying one beef slider and one Impossible slider to compare them. And in blind taste tests conducted by YouTubers and food bloggers, many couldn't tell the difference. The success at White Castle validated Patrick Brown's core thesis. Biology doesn't matter to the consumer. Flavor matters. Price matters. By pricing it at $1.99, Impossible Foods had democratized the technology. They proved that saving the planet didn't have to be a luxury good. The White Castle rollout expanded nationwide later that year, putting Impossible Foods into nearly 400 locations across the Midwest. It was a massive victory. It legitimized the product in the eyes of Middle America. But in the boardrooms of the global food giants, the White Castle experiment was seen as a warning shot. The giants of fast food, McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King, were watching closely. They saw the lines, they saw the buzz, and they realized that the plant-based trend wasn't a fad. It was a gold rush. One of those giants decided they didn't want to wait anymore. They wanted in. And they were about to offer Impossible Foods the biggest stage in the world, a stage so big it would threaten to break the company all over again, the Burger King partnership. By 2019, Impossible Foods had achieved what every startup dreams of: product market fit. But to achieve their mission of replacing animals in the food system by 2035, they couldn't just be a niche player in the slider market. They needed a whale. They needed the home of the Whopper. Burger King, owned by Restaurant Brands International, was looking for a way to shake up the stagnant fast food landscape. They saw McDonald's hesitating, stuck in a cycle of endless menu tweaks. Burger King saw an opportunity to be the first mover in the plant-based war, but the risk was colossal. The Whopper is not just a sandwich. It is the sacred cow of American fast food. It generates billions of dollars in revenue. You do not mess with the Whopper unless you are absolutely certain. The negotiations were secretive and intense. Burger King's executives, led by CMO Fernando Machado, laid down a non-negotiable challenge. The plant-based patty could not be cooked on a separate vegan grill. It had to go through the chain's signature flame broiler. It had to withstand the open fire, the conveyor belt, and the drop into the holding tray without falling apart or drying out. The Oakland factory sent the patties. The Burger King test kitchen fired up the broiler. The Heme performed its magic. As the heat hit the patty, the Heme catalyzed. It browned, it charred, it dripped fat onto the coals, creating that signature smoke flavor that is the DNA of Burger King. When the executives tasted it blind against the beef Whopper, the deal was sealed. They chose a release date that was a stroke of marketing genius. April 1st, 2019. April Fool's Day. The campaign was launched in St. Louis, Missouri. The premise was simple: the Impossible Whopper, 100% Whopper, 0% beef. They filmed real die-hard Whopper fans, truckers, construction workers, skeptics, eating the burger thinking it was beef, and then revealing the truth. The reactions were unscripted shock. "You're lying," one customer said. "That's a cow." The genius of the April Fool's launch was the subtext. It acknowledged the disbelief. It winked at the customer, saying, "We know this sounds like a joke, but it's real." The pilot in St. Louis was supposed to last for weeks. It sold out in days. The foot traffic in St. Louis Burger King skyrocketed by nearly 18%, a number that is unheard of in the fast food industry, where growth is usually measured in decimal points. Based on this explosive data, Burger King decided to skip the slow rollout. In August 2019, they pulled the trigger on a nationwide launch. Overnight, the Impossible Burger went from being available in a few thousand locations to being in over 7,000 Burger Kings across America. The Impossible Whopper became the cultural phenomenon of 2019. It was discussed on late-night talk shows. It was debated on Fox News. It was memified on Twitter. Financially, it was a supernova. Impossible Foods raised another $300 million in a Series E round, valuing the private company at over $2 billion. They were the hottest pre-IPO company in the world. They were partnering with Disney. They were launching in grocery stores. The Oakland factory was running 24/7, and they were already breaking ground on massive contract manufacturing deals to keep up. Patrick Brown had done it. He had taken a molecule found in the dirt and put it on the menu of the second largest burger chain in the world. He had tricked millions of carnivores into eating plants. But in the blinding light of this success, a shadow was forming. The Impossible Whopper had exposed the brand to a level of scrutiny it had never faced before. When you are a niche product in a New York bistro, nobody cares about your ingredient list. But when you are feeding millions of Americans in the heartland, people start reading the label. And what they saw on the label terrified them. They saw legemoglobin. They saw genetically engineered yeast. They saw soy. The honeymoon was ending. The clean label movement, the organic purists, and the shadowy forces of the traditional meat lobby were waking up. They realized that Impossible Foods wasn't just a veggie burger company. It was a biotech company infiltrating the food supply. The backlash was coming. And it wouldn't be about taste. It would be about the very definition of nature itself. When the livestock industry declared war. The rollout of the Impossible Whopper was a triumph of marketing, but it triggered a regulatory immune response. As millions of Americans took their first bite of Heme-infused protein, a powerful coalition of critics began to ask a simple, terrifying question. What exactly is this molecule? For decades, the plant-based food movement had been aligned with the natural food movement. The typical consumer of a veggie burger was also the typical consumer of organic kale and non-GMO tofu. They wanted food that was close to the earth, minimally processed, and free from industrial interference. Impossible Foods was the complete opposite. It was a product of synthetic biology. It was, by definition, a genetically modified organism. Patrick Brown had always known this would be a problem. That is why, years earlier, he had voluntarily approached the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to seek their blessing. He didn't legally have to. Under U.S. law, companies can self-affirm that an ingredient is generally recognized as safe. But Brown wanted the gold standard. He wanted the FDA's official seal of approval to silence the critics. It backfired. In 2015 and again in 2017, the FDA had pushed back. Internal memos revealed that the agency was concerned. They noted that soy legemoglobin had never been consumed by humans in these isolated, concentrated quantities before. While it existed in soy roots, humans don't eat soy roots. The FDA argued that Impossible Foods had not provided sufficient evidence that this novel protein wasn't an allergen. Or worse, this regulatory purgatory was a ticking time bomb. If the FDA decided to declare Heme an unsafe food additive, they could technically pull every Impossible Burger off the market. The company would be vaporized overnight. To satisfy the FDA, Patrick Brown, a lifelong vegan and animal rights advocate, had to make a decision that tore at his conscience. To prove that his plant-based meat was safe, he had to test it on animals. In 2018, news leaked that Impossible Foods had commissioned a study involving feeding high doses of heme to rats. Ultimately, 188 rats were killed and dissected to prove that the heme caused no toxic effects. The backlash from the vegan community was instantaneous and vitriolic. PETA issued blistering statements accusing Brown of hypocrisy. "You cannot save animals by killing them," the activists screamed. Brown tried to defend the decision with utilitarian logic. Sacrificing 188 rats to save billions of cows was a mathematical no-brainer. But in the emotional world of food ethics, math rarely wins. The company was branded as a traitor to the cause. Despite the controversy, the sacrifice worked. In July 2019, just as the Whopper was launching, the FDA finally issued a no-questions letter. This was the golden ticket. It meant the FDA accepted the safety of heme. It cleared the path for Impossible Foods to enter grocery stores, a market that is far more regulated than restaurants. But the war wasn't over. It had just moved to the courts. Enter the Center for Food Safety. This is a powerful nonprofit environmental advocacy group that has spent decades fighting the proliferation of GMOs. They viewed Impossible Foods not as a climate savior, but as a Trojan horse for the biotech industry. They argued that by normalizing genetically engineered yeast in food, Impossible was opening Pandora's box. The CFS filed a lawsuit challenging the FDA's approval. They argued that the FDA had lowered its standards, rushing the approval of a novel compound without long-term human testing. They coined and amplified the term that would haunt the brand, Frankenfood. The narrative they spun was effective. They painted a picture of a dystopian future where food is brewed in steel vats by men in white coats using DNA splicing techniques that we don't fully understand. They questioned the safety of the unknown proteins that might be created as byproducts during the yeast fermentation process. This narrative struck a nerve with the clean label moms and the whole food shoppers. When Impossible Foods finally launched in grocery stores in late 2019, they were met with a wall of skepticism in certain aisles. While Beyond Meat proudly displayed a non-GMO project verified butterfly on their package, Impossible Foods had to admit their bioengineered status. Whole Foods, the cathedral of organic consumption, initially refused to carry the Impossible Burger. For Jeff Bezos's grocery chain, which prided itself on banning artificial ingredients, Impossible was a philosophical contradiction. It was plant-based, yes, but was it food or was it technology? This rejection by the natural food establishment forced Impossible Foods into a strange corner. They were rejected by the granola crowd, so they had to double down on the tech bro crowd. They marketed themselves as a gadget. They were the iPhone of proteins. But as 2020 approached, the enemies of Impossible were no longer just the vegans or the environmentalists. The sleeping giant of the American Midwest, the cattle ranchers, had woken up. And they weren't going to sue over yeast, they were going to sue over the dictionary. While the scientists at the FDA were debating the safety of yeast, the cattle ranchers of America were debating the definition of reality. For years, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association had viewed veggie burgers as a joke. They were dry, tasteless pucks that posed zero threat to the dominance of the ribeye. But when the Impossible Whopper launched, the laughter stopped. The ranchers looked at the sales figures, and they realized they weren't facing a fad. They were facing an existential replacement. The meat lobby realized they couldn't beat Impossible Foods on coolness. They couldn't beat them on Twitter, so they decided to beat them in the State House. They launched a coordinated legislative assault designed to strip Impossible Foods of its most powerful weapon, its language. The ground zero of this war was Missouri. In 2018, backed by powerful agricultural lobbyists, the state of Missouri passed a landmark law that made it a crime to misrepresent a product as meat that was not derived from harvested production livestock or poultry. The target was unmistakable. The law wasn't about protecting consumers from accidentally buying a veggie burger. Nobody accidentally buys a $12 plant-based patty. The law was about protectionism. It was about ownership. The cattle industry argued that the word meat was their intellectual property. They contended that meat implies an animal, a slaughter, and a carcass. To call a block of fermented yeast and protein meat was, in their eyes, a fraudulent appropriation of their heritage. The penalties were severe. Companies violating the law could face fines of up to $1,000 per violation and even jail time. This triggered a domino effect. Following Missouri's lead, similar truth in labeling bills were introduced in more than 25 states from Arkansas to Mississippi. These were red state legislations, turning the grocery aisle into a battleground of the culture wars. The message was clear. If you want to sell your science experiment, fine. But don't you dare call it a burger. Call it a veggie disc. Call it a textured protein tube. But leave our words alone. For Impossible Foods, this was a lethal threat. Patrick Brown understood that language frames perception. If he was forced to label his product imitation beef substitute, the psychological connection to the carnivore brain would be severed. It would sound like dog food. To win, he had to be meat. He argued that meat was defined by its function, its texture, its flavor, its molecular structure, not its origin. He argued that a diamond is still a diamond whether it comes from a mine or a lab. Impossible Foods, along with the Tofurky Company and the ACLU, countersued. They argued that these labeling laws were a violation of the First Amendment. They claimed it was unconstitutional censorship designed to stifle competition. The legal battles were messy and expensive. In Arkansas, a judge eventually blocked the state's ban, calling it unconstitutional. But the damage was done. The labeling wars had successfully politicized the brand. Impossible Foods was no longer just a neutral option on the menu. It was a political statement. In the polarized landscape of 2020 America, eating an Impossible Burger became a signifier of your politics. To the coastal liberals, it was a badge of progress. To the rural conservatives, it was a symbol of Silicon Valley trying to destroy the American farmer. But the ranchers had one more card to play, a card that was far more damaging than a lawsuit. They began to attack the ingredient list itself. They stopped calling it fake meat and started using a new, terrifying term, ultra-processed. They bought full-page ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. These ads didn't talk about cows. They simply showed two lists. On one side, beef, one ingredient. On the other side, impossible. A paragraph of chemical names, methylcellulose, soy legumoglobin, zinc gluconate, thiamine hydrochloride. It was a brutal, effective pivot. The meat industry successfully flipped the script on health. They argued, sure, beef might have cholesterol, but at least it's natural. Do you really want to feed your children something made in a bioreactor? This narrative hit Impossible Foods right where they were weakest. They had spent so much time proving they were better for the planet. They had forgotten to prove they were better for the body. And as the world entered the health-obsessed paranoia of 2020, that oversight was about to cost them dearly. By 2020, Impossible Foods was fighting a war on two fronts. On one side, they had the cattle ranchers fighting for the word meat. On the other side, they had the environmentalists fighting about GMOs. But the third attack, the one that would do the most lasting damage to their reputation, came from inside the house. It came from other plant-based companies. For years, there was an unwritten truce in the vegan food world. We are all in this together against big meat. But as the market exploded into a multi-billion-dollar prize, that truce evaporated. Older, established plant-based brands who were watching their market share be devoured by the tech burgers decided to pull the knife out. In August 2020, a company called Light Life, a legacy brand known for making tempeh and simple veggie dogs, took out a full-page open letter in the New York Times. It was addressed to Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. The headline was brutal: "Make a clean break." The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive marketing. It accused Impossible Foods of creating hyper-processed food. It listed their ingredients like a toxicology report. Light Life positioned themselves as the real plant-based option, made from simple plants you could recognize, while painting Impossible as a science experiment gone wrong. This was plant-on-plant violence. It shattered the unity of the movement. It validated the worst fears of the consumers, that in their quest to save the planet, they were poisoning their bodies. The term ultra-processed food began to trend. Nutritionists started to dissect the Impossible Burger label with a cold, clinical eye. They pointed out the uncomfortable truth. To make plants taste like meat, you have to do terrible things to them. You have to extract the protein from soy using industrial processes. You have to use methylcellulose, a binder found in laxatives and wall paste, to hold the patty together. You have to saturate it with refined coconut oil to mimic the mouthfeel of beef fat. The nutritional panel was damning. An Impossible Burger had almost the same amount of saturated fat as a beef burger. It had more sodium. It was not a salad. It was a junk food indulgence that just happened to be made of plants. This stigma explained why Whole Foods Market, the holy grail of healthy retail, had kept Impossible off its shelves for so long. Whole Foods had a ban on certain additives, including specific forms of Heme and synthetic vitamins. For years, Amazon's grocery giant essentially told the hottest food tech startup in the world, "You are not clean enough for us." Although Whole Foods eventually capitulated and stocked the burger later in 2020, the hesitation spoke volumes. It cemented the idea that Impossible was tech, not food. Impossible Foods fought back aggressively. They called the Light Life campaign a desperate stunt by a dying brand. They published blog posts arguing that a beef burger is also processed by the cow's digestive system and the slaughterhouse. But the seed of doubt was planted. The health halo that had protected the brand in the early days was slipping. In 2016, people ate the Impossible Burger thinking it was a superfood. By 2020, they were eating it with a guilty conscience, wondering if the methylcellulose was gluing their intestines together. As the world entered the dark winter of the pandemic, this health anxiety merged with a broader skepticism about expertise and science. And just as Impossible Foods needed steady leadership to navigate these choppy waters, the internal cracks in the company began to widen. The scientists and the salespeople were no longer speaking the same language. Why did Patrick Brown have to step down as CEO? When the world shut down in March 2020, Impossible Foods seemed for a brief moment to be the smartest company on earth. As the COVID-19 virus tore through the population, it wreaked havoc on the traditional meat industry. Slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants, damp, crowded, refrigerated environments, became super spreader events. Giants like Tyson and Smithfield were forced to shut down facilities. The supply chain of beef and pork fractured. For the first time in decades, Americans walked into grocery stores and saw empty meat cases. Wendy's ran out of burgers. Kroger rationed ground beef. Into this void stepped Impossible Foods. Their meat was not made in a crowded slaughterhouse. It was made in a sterile stainless steel bioreactor in Oakland. The virus couldn't infect yeast. The supply chain was bulletproof. Impossible Foods seized the moment with aggressive opportunism. They accelerated their retail rollout, launching in nearly 2,000 grocery stores, including Kroger and Albertsons, in a single month. They pitched themselves as the reliable alternative. When the real meat ran out, consumers panic bought the fake meat. Retail sales exploded. In mid-2020, Impossible reported retail growth rates of over 100%. To the outside observer and to the investors pouring money into their Series F and G rounds, it looked like the prophecy was coming true. The virus had killed the cow. But this was a mirage. It was the COVID paradox. The explosive retail growth was masking a catastrophic wound. Impossible Foods was, at its heart, a restaurant brand. Their entire business model was built on the back of Burger King, White Castle, and 30,000 independent restaurants. When the lockdowns hit, those restaurants went dark. The high-margin food service revenue evaporated overnight. The retail sales were high, but they were driven by novelty and desperation, not habit. People were buying Impossible Burger because it was the only thing left on the shelf, or because they were bored and cooking at home. They weren't converting, they were experimenting. And as the pandemic dragged into 2021, the cracks in the leadership team began to show. For years, Impossible Foods had been run by a dynamic duo, Patrick Brown, the visionary scientist, and David Lee, the pragmatic COO/CFO. Brown was the soul of the company, the man who wanted to destroy the meat industry at any cost. Lee was the brain, the man who knew how to talk to Wall Street, who structured the Burger King deal, and who kept the lights on. But in early 2021, David Lee announced he was leaving the company. The news was buried in the tech press, but to insiders, it was a seismic event. Lee was the adult in the room. He was the one who balanced Brown's radical idealism with commercial reality. His departure signaled a shift. Without Lee, the company tilted heavily back towards science and away from sales. Brown, now unchecked, doubled down on his aggressive rhetoric. He publicly dismissed the competition. He called the meat industry dead walking. He predicted that animal agriculture would be obsolete by 2035, a claim that even his staunchest supporters found delusional. The company began to drift. They spent millions on R&D for Impossible milk, instead of fixing the price parity of their burgers. They ignored the data showing that once the slaughterhouses reopened and the price of beef stabilized, consumers were switching back to the real thing. By the end of 2021, the COVID bump had flatlined. The novelty had worn off. The world was reopening, but the appetite for the Impossible Burger was not returning to its 2019 peaks. The stock market, which had been in a frenzy for plant-based IPOs, turned cold. Impossible Foods had planned to go public at a valuation of $10 billion, but as the year closed, they quietly shelved the IPO plans. The window had closed, the bubble was leaking, and the company was about to face the hardest truth of all. It is easy to sell a burger once. It is incredibly hard to sell it twice. The plant-based revolution was built on a promise. Patrick Brown had sworn, time and time again, that as Impossible Foods scaled up, the price would come down. He preached the gospel of price parity. He argued that because a cow is an inefficient machine, eating 25 pounds of crops to produce 1 pound of meat, the laws of physics dictated that plant-based meat must eventually be cheaper than animal meat. But in 2021 and 2022, the laws of physics crashed into the laws of economics. As the world emerged from the pandemic, it walked straight into the jaws of a global inflation crisis. Supply chains broke, energy costs spiked, the price of everything, from gas to grain, skyrocketed. For the average American family, the grocery trip became a source of anxiety. In this harsh new economic climate, the Impossible Burger faced a lethal disadvantage. Despite years of scaling, despite the massive factories, it was still a premium luxury product. At the grocery store, a pound of commodity ground beef, the pink slime stuff in the styrofoam tray, cost around $4 or $5. A 12-ounce package of Impossible Burger cost around $8 or $9. When times were good and consumers felt flush with stimulus checks, they were willing to pay the green tax. They were willing to pay extra to feel like they were saving the planet. But when inflation hit 9%, that calculus changed overnight. The consumer didn't stop caring about the climate. They just couldn't afford to pay for it anymore. Data from the retail sector showed a disturbing trend. The trial rate for Impossible Foods remained high. People were still curious enough to buy it once. But the repeat rate fell off a cliff. The novelty had worn off. Families looked at their receipts and realized they could feed their kids 2 beef burger nights for the price of 1 Impossible night. The cow, for all its inefficiency, had a secret weapon: subsidies. The American meat industry is supported by billions of dollars in government subsidies for corn and soy feed. It is a highly optimized, low-margin machine that has spent a century driving the cost of meat down to the floor. Impossible Foods was a venture-backed tech company trying to compete with a commodity market. They were fighting a price war against an opponent who could afford to lose money longer than they could. Impossible Foods tried to fight back. In 2021, they announced price cuts of 15 to 20% for distributors, but it wasn't enough. The price gap was still too wide. This failure to reach price parity exposed a flaw in the business model. Impossible Foods had assumed that scaling the technology would naturally drop costs, just like computer chips or solar panels. But food is not software. You still have to grow the soy. You still have to pay for the stainless steel tanks. You still have to ship heavy frozen products on refrigerated trucks. The Moore's Law of meat that Patrick Brown had predicted did not happen. Instead, the category hit a wall. Sales of plant-based meat in U.S. grocery stores, which had been growing at double digits, suddenly flattened. Then, in late 2021, they began to decline. The narrative on Wall Street shifted instantly. Analysts who had hyped the future of food began to issue downgrades. They realized that the total addressable market for expensive fake meat was much smaller than they thought. It wasn't the whole world. It was just the upper middle class. And as the economic pressure mounted, Impossible Foods found itself walking into another trap. Not economic, but cultural. They had spent years positioning themselves as a progressive, disruptive force. Now that identity was about to be weaponized against them in the escalating American culture wars. If inflation was the economic headwind, the culture war was the hurricane. By 2022, the United States was deeply polarized, and everything from beer to razors to shoes was being viewed through a political lens. It was only a matter of time before the rage turned toward the dinner plate. For years, Impossible Foods had tried to remain politically neutral. Patrick Brown's goal was to feed everyone, red state or blue state. The partnership with White Castle and Burger King was explicitly designed to prove that plant-based meat wasn't just for coastal liberals, it was for real Americans. But in August 2022, that strategy collided with reality. The flashpoint was unlikely: Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel is an American institution. It is a chain of old country stores scattered across the highways of the South and Midwest. It is famous for its rocking chairs on the front porch, its biscuits, and its unapologetic nostalgia for a simpler time. Its demographic is older, conservative, and fiercely loyal. In the summer of 2022, Cracker Barrel made a modest update to its menu. They added a build-your-own breakfast option featuring Impossible Sausage. They announced it with a harmless Facebook post. Discover new meat frontiers. Experience the taste of Impossible Sausage. The reaction was not a food debate. It was a digital riot. Thousands of angry comments flooded the post. Loyal customers accused Cracker Barrel of going woke. They threatened to boycott the chain. They called the sausage fake news food and liberal garbage. One comment, which went viral, summarized the sentiment. You just lost a customer of 20 years. I don't want your woke meat. The term woke meat began to circulate in right-wing media ecosystems. Impossible Foods was no longer seen as a cool tech product. It was seen as a symbol of the Great Reset, a conspiracy theory claiming that global elites were trying to force Americans to stop eating meat to control the population. This politicization was a disaster for Impossible Foods. They had spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince the meat eater that their product was just like beef. But the culture war had successfully framed it as an attack on American masculinity and tradition. The insult soy boy, a derogatory term used to describe effeminate, weak men who consume soy products, became weaponized against the brand. Eating an Impossible Burger was framed as an act of submission to the liberal agenda. Eating a real steak was framed as an act of rebellion and patriotism. Impossible Foods tried to respond with humor, posting sassy tweets about how much they loved their meat eaters. But the damage was done. The brand had become toxic in the very regions they needed to conquer to reach mass scale. This cultural rejection had real-world consequences. When restaurant chains looked at the Cracker Barrel controversy, they got cold feet. Why risk alienating 50% of your customer base just to offer a vegan option? The momentum of new restaurant partnerships slowed to a crawl. Impossible Foods found itself trapped. They were too processed for the health-conscious liberals and too woke for the conservative meat eaters. They were a brand without a country. And as the sales numbers began to soften in late 2022, the board of directors realized that the man who built the company, the uncompromising idealist Patrick Brown, might no longer be the right person to save it. The hot dog invasion and the school strategy. By the spring of 2022, the writing was on the wall. Impossible Foods was stuck. They had won the science war, but they were losing the business war. The Tesla strategy had stalled. The stock market IPO was dead in the water, and the culture wars were eating away at the brand's reputation. The board of directors faced a difficult truth. Patrick Brown was a genius, but he was not a wartime CEO. Brown was an academic at heart. He was stubborn, idealistic, and prone to picking fights with entire industries. He treated Impossible Foods like a crusade, not a corporation. He refused to compromise on the mission. When asked about competitors or market slowdowns, he would often double down on his 2035 prophecy that animal agriculture would be dead in a decade. But investors didn't want prophecies anymore. They wanted profits. In April 2022, a seismic shift occurred. Patrick Brown announced he was stepping down as CEO. He would move into a new role titled Chief Visionary Officer, a classic Silicon Valley title often given to founders who are being gently moved away from the steering wheel. To replace him, the board brought in a heavyweight from the world of consumer goods, Peter McGinnis. McGuinness was the opposite of Brown in almost every way. He wasn't a scientist, he was an ad man. He had spent years as the president of Chobani, the yogurt giant. He was credited with turning Greek yogurt from a niche product into a refrigerator staple. He understood supply chains, he understood retail relationships, and most importantly, he understood that food is about marketing, not just molecules. McGuinness walked into the headquarters in Redwood City and saw a company that was bloated and unfocused. Under the growth at all costs mindset of the previous years, Impossible Foods had hired too many people. They had teams working on moonshot projects that had no path to revenue. In October 2022, just months after taking the helm, McGuinness pulled the trigger on a painful decision that signaled the end of the honeymoon. Impossible Foods announced a massive round of layoffs, cutting 6% of its workforce. This was followed by another larger round of cuts in early 2023. The message was clear. The days of unlimited R&D budgets were over. The science project phase was finished. Impossible Foods was now a packaged goods company, and it had to operate with the discipline of a Kraft or a Nestlé. McGuinness shifted the strategy immediately. He stopped talking about saving the planet in every interview. Instead, he started talking about taste and convenience. He criticized the brand's previous marketing for being too elitist and too focused on the coasts. He wanted to broaden the tent. He launched a new marketing campaign called Meat, featuring a fat, juicy burger with almost no mention of the environment. It was a strategic pivot to try and win back the regular meat eater who had been alienated by the woke narratives. But cultural turnarounds are slow, and the market was moving fast. Even as McGuinness tried to right the ship, the external data continued to worsen. The entire plant-based meat category, not just Impossible, but Beyond Meat and everyone else, was shrinking. Sales were down double digits year over year. The investors who had poured billions into the sector began to panic. They looked at their spreadsheets and realized that the total addressable market wasn't 300 million Americans. It was maybe 30 million Americans who were willing to overpay for a fake burger. The valuation of the company, which had once soared to $7 billion in private markets, began to look like a fantasy. And as 2023 dawned, the whispers of a down round or a collapse began to circulate in Silicon Valley. The bubble hadn't just leaked, it had burst. By 2023, the data was undeniable. The S-curve of adoption, that magical line that tech investors pray for, where a product goes from zero to ubiquity in a vertical line, had broken. For 5 years, Impossible Foods had operated on the assumption that they were selling the iPhone. They believed that once people tried the superior technology, they would never go back to the flip phone. But the sales figures of 2023 revealed a terrifying truth. A burger is not a phone. Nielsen IQ, the arbiter of grocery store truth, released data that sent a chill through Silicon Valley. Sales of refrigerated plant-based meat in the U.S. had not just slowed, they had declined by double digits. In some quarters, volume was down nearly 20%. It wasn't just that people weren't buying more, people were buying less. The churn rate was high. Millions of Americans had tried the Impossible Burger once, perhaps out of curiosity or a New Year's resolution, and then simply drifted back to beef. The reason was the uncanny valley of food. In robotics, the uncanny valley is the feeling of revulsion people get when a robot looks almost human, but not quite. Impossible Foods had hit the culinary equivalent. To the die-hard carnivore, the burger was impressive, but it wasn't perfect. It didn't have the exact same mouthfeel. It didn't have the same lingering fatty aftertaste. And when the novelty wore off, the consumer was left with a product that was expensive, highly processed, and almost as good as the real thing. almost is not enough to change the world. This reality check crushed the company's valuation. Just 2 years prior, during the peak of the hype in 2021, secondary market trades and investor whispers had pegged Impossible Foods at a valuation of nearly $7 billion, with eyes on a $10 billion IPO. But in 2023, reports from financial research firms like Contrary Research painted a grim picture. The secondary market for Impossible shares, where employees and early investors trade stock before an IPO, froze. Shares were reportedly trading at discounts of 40% to 50% from their highs. The implied valuation plummeted. Some analysts suggested the company was now worth closer to $3 or $4 billion, essentially erasing years of value creation. The dream of a blockbuster IPO was officially dead. The window had slammed shut. Internally, the mood shifted from arrogance to survival. The company's revenue, which had been projected to rocket toward $1 billion, had stalled. While Impossible Foods is private and doesn't release audited financials, leaks and estimates suggested that revenue was hovering in the $300 to $400 million range. A respectable number for a food company, but a disastrous number for a tech company that had raised nearly $2 billion in venture capital. They were burning cash to maintain their massive R&D facilities and marketing campaigns, but the growth engine had stalled. They had hit the green ceiling. They had successfully captured the 5% of the population that cared about the environment, but they had failed to capture the 95% who just wanted lunch. The market reality of 2023 was a humbling lesson in humility. Impossible Foods realized they were not immune to the laws of gravity. They were not a software company with zero marginal costs. They were a manufacturing company with heavy overheads, perishable inventory, and a customer base that was fickle, price-sensitive, and easily bored. As the year came to a close, Peter McGuinness and the new leadership team faced an existential crossroads. The burger war was essentially lost. Beef consumption was actually rising in the U.S., not falling. The mission to end animal agriculture by 2035 was looking less like a business plan and more like a delusional fantasy. To survive, they had to evolve. They had to stop trying to be a messiah and start trying to be a better food company. They had to look beyond the burger. They had to look at the one meat that is even more processed, even more unhealthy, and even more beloved than beef. They looked at the hot dog. By the dawn of 2024, the burger war had settled into a bloody stalemate. The early exponential growth was gone, replaced by a grinding battle for market share against a resurgent beef industry and a skeptical public. The criticism that had wounded the company most deeply was the ultra-processed label. The narrative that Impossible meat was fake, synthetic, and full of chemicals had stuck. Facing this reality, CEO Peter McGuinness made a strategic decision that seemed, on the surface, to be an admission of defeat. If the consumer was rejecting Impossible beef because it was too processed, then the company shouldn't try to make a salad. They should make something that was supposed to be processed. They should make a hot dog. The hot dog is the ultimate paradox of the American diet. It is beloved, consumed by the billions at baseball games and backyard barbecues, yet it is universally acknowledged to be mystery meat. No one eats a hot dog thinking it is health food. No one eats a hot dog asking for the ingredient list. The hot dog is, by definition, a tube of emulsified protein, spices, and binders. It is the lowest common denominator of meat. For Impossible Foods, this was the perfect Trojan horse. The natural fallacy that hurt their burger didn't apply here. When a critic says, That Impossible hot dog is full of weird ingredients. The consumer's response is, so is the pork one. By entering a category where the bar for purity was already on the floor, Impossible Foods neutralized their biggest weakness. But scientifically, the hot dog was a beast. The challenge wasn't flavor. Hot dogs mostly taste like salt, smoke, and garlic, which is easy to replicate. The challenge was the snap. That specific mechanical reaction when teeth break the casing of a sausage, the resistance followed by the burst of juice, is the holy grail of encased meats. Traditionally, this is achieved using animal intestines or collagen casings. To do it with plants, the R&D team in Redwood City had to invent a new edible casing technology, likely derived from alginate, that could mimic the tensile strength of a sheep's intestine. In early 2024, Impossible Foods rolled out the Impossible Beef Hot Dog. They didn't launch it at a health food expo. They launched it in the most aggressive, unapologetic way possible. A pop-up stand in New York City handing out free dogs to skeptics. The marketing campaign was a masterclass in reading the room. They didn't talk about saving the Amazon rainforest. They didn't talk about cholesterol. They leaned into the nostalgia and the gluttony. They marketed it as a guilty pleasure that just happened to be made of plants. The reception was startling. The Impossible hot dog began to outperform the burger in repeat purchase metrics. It turned out that for hot dogs, the uncanny valley simply didn't exist. Since real hot dogs already possess a rubbery uniform texture, the plant-based mimic was indistinguishable. This success signaled a broader strategic shift, the pivot to pork. For the first decade of its life, Impossible was a beef company. But globally, pork is the king. It is the most consumed meat in the world, the staple protein of China and much of Europe. And unlike a steak, pork is often consumed in processed forms: sausages, meatballs, dumplings, Spam. Impossible Foods realized that their Heme technology, the blood, was actually more versatile than they thought. By tweaking the pH and the fat ratios, they could strip out the iron taste of beef and replace it with the savory, fatty profile of pork. The launch of Impossible Pork and Impossible Sausage was a play for the breakfast market. They infiltrated Starbucks with the Impossible Breakfast Sandwich. They entered the frozen pizza aisle with sausage crumbles. This was a volume play. It was a recognition that while they might never replace the ribeye steak on a Friday night, they could easily replace the greasy sausage patty in a Tuesday morning croissant. This pivot to mystery meat, sausages, hot dogs, bratwursts, saved the company's volume numbers in 2024. It proved that if you stop trying to be a health food and start trying to be a delicious indulgence, the American consumer will forgive your ingredient list. But Peter McGuinness knew that junk food was only half the battle. There was still a massive demographic: the health-conscious moms, the fitness enthusiasts, the doctor-ordered dieters who had abandoned the brand because of the saturated fat content. To win them back, he couldn't sell them a hot dog. He had to sell them redemption. He had to fix the nutritional label, and that required going back to the lab to create a product that defied the laws of flavor, a burger that tasted like fat but had the profile of a salad. While the hot dog strategy secured the late-night cravings of the masses, Impossible Foods faced a lingering existential rot in its brand equity, the health argument. By 2024, the health halo, the automatic assumption that plant-based equals healthy, had completely evaporated. The meat lobby's ultra-processed campaign had been devastatingly effective. When a mother looked at the nutritional label of an Impossible burger, she saw 8 grams of saturated fat, roughly the same as a fatty beef patty derived primarily from refined coconut oil. She saw a calorie count that offered no advantage over the cow. The narrative had shifted from "it saves the planet" to "it clogs your arteries." For a company founded by a medical doctor, this was an intolerable vulnerability. They were losing the health and wellness demographic, the yogis, the runners, the California optimization crowd, who had been their earliest evangelists. These consumers were migrating back to grass-fed beef or bison, convinced by influencers that ancestral diets were superior to seed oils. To stop this migration, Impossible Foods launched a counterstrike. They initiated a crash R&D program to do what cows cannot do: updates. A cow is biologically locked. You cannot easily engineer a cow to have 50% less saturated fat without decades of selective breeding. But Impossible Foods is a software company in disguise. If the user experience was too fatty, they could simply rewrite the code. The result was Impossible Beef Light. Launched with a sleek white and green packaging design that visually signaled diet and cleanliness, this new SKU was engineered to go head-to-head with lean ground beef. The engineering challenge was immense. In the culinary world, fat is flavor. Fat is moisture. When you remove the coconut oil chunks that give the original Impossible Burger its succulence, you risk creating a dry, hockey puck texture, the very thing that doomed the veggie burgers of the 1990s. To solve this, the scientists leaned harder on their secret weapon, Heme. They utilized the molecule's potent ability to transmit meaty signals to the brain to compensate for the missing fat. By rebalancing the amino acid profile and tweaking the binding matrix, they managed to create a patty that retained the bleed and the sear, but with 0 milligrams of cholesterol and 50% less saturated fat than the original. This wasn't just a product launch, it was a certification war. Impossible Foods spent months aggressively courting the American Heart Association. In the food industry, the AHA's heart check mark is the gold standard. It is a shield that deflects criticism. When Impossible Beef Light finally earned that certification, it was a major strategic victory. They plastered the heart check mark on every box. They launched ad campaigns targeting the flexitarian dad, the guy in his 40s, who loves burgers but is terrified of his cholesterol numbers. The messaging shifted from "save the earth" to "save your heart." This move allowed Impossible Foods to bifurcate its strategy. They now had the indulgent line for the taste seekers and the nutritional line for the health seekers. It was a strategy borrowed directly from Coca-Cola. The light strategy began to stabilize the brand's perception. It gave the clean label skeptics a reason to come back. It silenced the critics who claimed the product was just junk food. But Peter McGuinness knew that winning the beef war, even with a light version, was only fighting for a shrinking slice of the pie. In the United States, beef consumption per capita has been slowly declining for decades. The real growth, the protein that was conquering the dinner tables of the world, wasn't red meat, it was white meat. To truly become a massive food giant, Impossible Foods had to cross the species barrier. They had to leave the mammal behind and take on the bird. They had to figure out how to fake a chicken. Solving the beef burger was a monumental scientific achievement, but from a purely mathematical standpoint, it was only a warm-up. If the goal of Impossible Foods was to collapse the animal agriculture industry, they were targeting the wrong animal. The cow is the climate villain, but the chicken is the consumption king. Globally, humans consume nearly 50 billion chickens per year. In the United States, chicken consumption per capita has tripled since the 1970s, while beef has steadily declined. We are a species addicted to poultry. To leave the chicken market untouched would be to surrender the war before it even began. But creating an impossible chicken presented a completely different set of problems then beef. With the burger, the magic was the Heme. The goal was to make it bleed, to make it red, to make it taste metallic. Chicken is the opposite. It is the anti-Heme meat. It is defined by what it lacks. It is mild, white, and flavor neutral. The challenge with chicken wasn't flavor, it was architecture. A ground beef burger is unstructured. It is a chaotic mix of fat and protein. It is easy to hide plant ingredients in a mush. But chicken, specifically the breast and the tender, is a whole muscle. It has long, striated fibers that tear in a specific way when you bite them. It has a snap and a chew that is incredibly difficult to replicate with soy or wheat protein, which naturally wants to be a sponge. Impossible Foods had to reinvent their technology. They had to move away from the fermentation of blood and move toward the physics of extrusion. They utilized a process called high moisture extrusion, which involves pushing plant proteins through heating and cooling barrels under extreme pressure to force the molecules to align into long, fibrous strands. It is essentially weaving meat out of plants. In late 2021, they dipped their toe in the water with Impossible chicken nuggets. The nugget was a strategic entry point. Much like the hot dog, the chicken nugget is already a highly processed, battered, and fried product. The uncanny valley is forgiving. If you bread anything and fry it, it tastes good. But in 2024, they escalated the battle. They launched Impossible chicken tenders and Impossible fillets. These were not ground slurries, they were whole-cut mimics. This launch was a direct declaration of war against the biggest fast food item of the modern era, the chicken sandwich. The chicken wars that had raged between Popeyes and Chick-fil-A were now a three-way fight, with Impossible entering the ring. The chicken frontier offered Impossible Foods a massive advantage: cost. Growing a chicken is cheaper than growing a cow, but it is still expensive. It requires grain, water, heating, and waste management. But producing soy and wheat for nuggets is incredibly cheap. As the supply chain stabilized, Impossible Foods found that they could reach price parity with premium chicken brands much faster than they could with beef. By 2025, the Impossible chicken nugget had become a staple in school cafeterias and theme parks. It was the ultimate stealth product. Kids, the most notoriously picky eaters on the planet, were eating them by the millions, often without knowing or caring that they were eating plants. And this realization that the way to win was through the children led Peter McGuinness to the most ambitious and perhaps most insidious strategy in the company's history. If you can't convince the old dogs to learn new tricks, you simply wait for a new generation of puppies. By 2024, Impossible Foods had accepted a hard sociological truth. You cannot teach an old dog new tricks, and you cannot convince a 60-year-old Texan to trade his brisket for fermented yeast. The Boomer and Gen X demographics were calcified. Their emotional connection to meat was too deep, too nostalgic, and too politically charged to be broken by a clever ad campaign. So, Impossible Foods stopped trying. They looked at the demographic data and realized that their salvation did not lie in the present, but in the future. They pivoted their entire marketing machine to target two specific cohorts, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. These generations are fundamentally different. They are climate natives. They have never known a world that wasn't burning. For them, climate change isn't a political debate. It is an existential anxiety. A survey by Pew Research showed that Gen Z is willing to pay significantly more for sustainable products than any previous generation. To them, eating meat isn't a badge of masculinity, it's a badge of guilt. Impossible Foods decided to weaponize this anxiety. They launched campaigns on TikTok, not television. They used influencers who spoke the language of social justice and environmentalism. They positioned the Impossible Burger not just as food, but as a form of activism. Eat this burger, fight the system. But the most potent part of this strategy wasn't on social media, it was in the cafeteria. In a move that went largely unnoticed by the financial press, Impossible Foods secured massive contracts with K-12 school districts across California and major metropolitan areas. They replaced the mystery meat tacos and the soggy chicken nuggets of the American school lunch with Impossible Tacos and Impossible Nuggets. This was a generational bet. It was a play for the long-term palate calibration of the human species. Taste is acquired. It is cultural. If a child grows up eating McDonald's beef, they crave that specific flavor profile for the rest of their life. But if a 5-year-old in Gen Alpha grows up eating Impossible Nuggets in their school cafeteria, that flavor becomes their baseline. They don't view it as fake meat. They just view it as meat. By embedding themselves in the childhoods of millions of Americans, Impossible Foods is playing a 20-year game. They are banking on the fact that when these children become adults, the idea of slaughtering a cow will seem not only cruel, but archaic, like using a rotary phone or smoking on an airplane. This strategy is insidious to the cattle ranchers, who understand the threat perfectly. If you lose the youth, you lose the future. The ranchers responded by lobbying for Ag in the Classroom programs, trying to keep traditional agriculture in the curriculum. But Impossible Foods has the upper hand of convenience. Their product is pre-cooked, safe from salmonella, and helps districts meet their carbon reduction goals. By 2025, Impossible Foods had effectively given up on the dinner tables of the Cracker Barrel crowd. They were content to wait for them to age out of the market. They were building a fortress around the youth, creating a brand loyalty that was fused with the very identity of the next generation. They weren't just selling lunch, they were selling the future to the people who would have to live in it. The Tesla of food, or the Kodak of dining. But even with the youth on their side, the question remains, is biology destiny? Can a tech company truly erase 1,000,000 years of evolution? Or will the human craving for the real thing always return? As the credits prepare to roll on the first 15 years of the Impossible experiment, we are left with a single burning question. It is the question that haunts every investor in Silicon Valley and every rancher in Montana. Is Impossible Foods the Tesla of food, or is it the Kodak? The Tesla argument is seductive. Like Tesla, Impossible Foods entered a stagnant, polluting industry with a superior technology. They forced the incumbents to panic. Just as Tesla forced GM and Ford to rush into electric vehicles, Impossible Foods forced Tyson, Nestle, and Burger King to rush into plant-based meat. Even if Impossible Foods were to go bankrupt tomorrow, they have already won the war of influence. They have shifted the trajectory of the global food system. They proved that the cow is a technology, and like all technologies, it is subject to disruption. But the Kodak argument is darker and perhaps more realistic. Kodak invented the digital camera, but they failed to understand how people actually took photos. Impossible Foods invented digital meat, but they may have failed to understand how people actually eat. Food is not a phone. It is not a car. It is biological, emotional, and deeply irrational. When you buy a Tesla, you get a faster, quieter, better car. When you buy an Impossible Burger, you get a product that is, at best, almost as good as the real thing, but costs more and comes with a chemistry set on the label. The valley of death for Impossible Foods is the realization that biology might hit a hard limit. Software can be updated infinitely, but flavor, texture, There might be an uncanny valley that science simply cannot cross. There may be something in the primal evolutionary brain of the human species that will always crave the specific nutrient density and hormonal signal of animal flesh. So, what is the future? It is likely not the utopia Patrick Brown predicted, where animal agriculture reaches zero by 2035. That was a fantasy. The cow is not going extinct. Instead, the future is likely a hybrid era. In 1910, the car didn't immediately kill the horse, but it relegated the horse from a utility to a luxury. Impossible Foods and the biotech industry may do the same to the cow. We are heading toward a world where commodity meat, the cheap ground slurry and fast food tacos and frozen lasagnas, is replaced by plants. It makes no economic sense to grow a whole conscious animal just to grind it into a paste. Impossible Foods will own the low end. They will own the nuggets, the hot dogs, and the cafeteria burgers. But real meat, the ribeye steak, the bone-in chop, the slow-roasted brisket will remain. It will become expensive. It will become rare. It will become a luxury item for special occasions, produced by regenerative farms, not industrial feedlots. Impossible Foods set out to play God. They tried to rewrite the code of life to save the world. They stumbled. They were arrogant. They underestimated the power of culture and the resilience of nature. But in their hubris, they did something magnificent. They forced us to look at the burger on our plate and ask for the first time in history, do we really need the cow? They showed us that the impossible was just an engineering challenge waiting to be solved. And even if they never reach the promised land, they have undeniably pointed the way. The cow is safe for now, but the fence is broken.